I stood in the Goodwill parking lot, watching my son Marcus drive away without a backward glance. The rain had started to fall, light at first, then harder, soaking through my wool coat as I clutched a single cardboard box of donated items. 57. Years old, and I was learning what it felt like to be disposable. The red taillights of his BMW disappeared around the corner, leaving me standing there like a piece of furniture he'd finally decided to get rid of. He'd promised to come back. 20 minutes, he'd said. Just dropping something off at the bank real quick. That was 3 hours ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I should have seen it coming. The signs had been there for months, maybe years. But when you love someone with your whole heart, you find ways to explain away the little cruelties, the small betrayals, the gradual erosion of respect. You tell yourself it's temporary stress, work pressure, anything but the truth that's staring you in the face. You tell yourself that family means something, that the bonds you've spent decades building can't just dissolve overnight. You're wrong. Standing there in that parking lot, mascara probably running down my cheeks, I felt something crack inside me. Not break exactly. More like the sound ice makes when it's about to shatter but hasn't quite given way yet. I was Beverly Anderson, a woman who had built a small empire from nothing, who had raised a son as a single mother, who had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities I never had. And this was how it ended. Abandoned at a thrift store like an old lamp that didn't match the decor anymore. But what Marcus didn't know, what no one knew except my lawyer and my accountant, was that I had been planning something for months. Something that would teach him exactly what abandonment felt like. Something that would show him the true cost of treating your mother like she was disposable. Because sometimes, when someone shows you who they really are, you have to believe them. And sometimes you have to show them who you really are too. There was a time when Marcus thought I hung the moon and painted the stars. When he was little, maybe 5 or 6, he used to tell anyone who would listen that his mama was the smartest, prettiest, strongest woman in the whole wide world. He'd wrap his small arms around my legs when I came home from work, still in my waitress uniform, smelling like coffee and kitchen grease, and announce that he was going to marry me when he grew up. I'd laugh and ruffle his dark hair, the same shade as mine before the gray started creeping in, and tell him he'd find someone much better than his old mama someday. Back then, it was just the two of us against the world. Marcus's father had disappeared before his 2nd birthday, leaving nothing but unpaid bills and a baby who looked exactly like him. I was 22, working double shifts at Mel's Diner on Route 9, coming home to a cramped apartment above the laundromat where the walls were so thin you could hear every conversation, every argument, every late-night television program from the neighbors. But in that little apartment, Marcus and I built our own universe. We had pancake breakfasts on Sunday mornings, even if it was just the 99-cent mix from the grocery store. We had movie nights on the second-hand couch I'd bought for $30, sharing a bowl of popcorn and whispering commentary so we wouldn't wake the people downstairs. Marcus was brilliant, even as a toddler. He could count to 100 before he turned 3, and by 4 he was reading picture books to me at bedtime, his little finger following each word carefully across the page. Teachers loved him. He was polite, curious, always raising his hand with thoughtful questions. Other parents would compliment me on how well-behaved he was, how articulate, how clearly he'd been raised with love and attention. I'd beam with pride, knowing that despite everything we lacked materially, I was giving him something money couldn't buy, the absolute certainty that he was loved, valued, and worth fighting for. Those early years were hard financially, but they were rich in ways that mattered. When Marcus lost his first tooth, I made a big production of the Tooth Fairy's visit, leaving quarters under his pillow, along with a tiny handwritten note. When? He had nightmares. I'd crawl into his twin bed and tell him stories about brave little boys who could defeat dragons with nothing but their clever minds and kind hearts. When he wanted a bicycle for his 7th birthday, I worked extra shifts for 2 months, saving every tip until I could buy him a shiny red one from the local bike shop. The look on his face Christmas morning when he saw it propped against our little tree was worth every aching foot, every late night, every moment of exhaustion. I had dreams back then, ambitions that extended beyond the diner and the apartment. I'd started taking business classes at the community college, studying. Late into the night after Marcus went to bed, I had this vision of opening my own restaurant someday, a place where the food was exceptional and the atmosphere was warm, where families could come and feel special without breaking the bank. I'd sketch floor plans on napkins during slow shifts, imagining where the tables would go, what the menu would look like, how I'd train my staff to treat every customer like family. Marcus would sit at the kitchen table doing his homework while I studied, both of us working quietly in the lamplight. Sometimes he'd look up from his math problems and ask what I was learning about. I'd explain concepts like profit margins and customer service. And he'd nod seriously, as if he understood that Mama was working toward something bigger, something better for both of us. He'd say things like, "When you have your restaurant, Mama, I'm going to be your best customer." And my heart would nearly burst with love for this little boy who believed so completely in my dreams. When Marcus was 8, everything changed. I'd been waitressing at Mel's for 6 years, and I knew every regular customer's order by heart, could predict exactly how much each table would tip, could work a busy Friday night with my eyes closed. But I also knew it was a dead end. The owner, Mel himself, was a decent man, but not particularly ambitious. The place looked exactly the same as it had in 1975, complete with cracked vinyl booths and a coffee machine that temperamental on the best days. I wanted more, not just for me, but for Marcus, who was getting old enough to notice that his school clothes came from discount stores, and our grocery budget was perpetually tight. That's when I took the biggest risk of my life. I'd saved up $3,000, every penny earned through double shifts, careful budgeting, and the occasional small tip from a generous customer. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start something. I'd heard about a small cafe space for rent downtown. Nothing fancy, but in a good location near the courthouse and the community college. The rent was reasonable, and the previous tenant had left behind some basic equipment. I spent weeks creating a business plan, calculating costs, figuring out how to make it work. When I told Marcus about my plan to open Beverly's Kitchen, his eyes lit up like Christmas morning. "You mean you'll be the boss, Mama?" he asked. When I nodded, he threw his arms around me and said, "I always knew you were going to be somebody important." That night, we celebrated with ice cream for dinner and spent hours talking about what the restaurant would be like. Marcus suggested, we should have a kids' menu with pictures and maybe a little corner with books where families could sit and read together. His enthusiasm was infectious, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was stepping toward something instead of just surviving day to day. Opening Beverly's Kitchen was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The first few months were brutal. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I was working 18-hour days, cooking, serving, cleaning, doing the books, handling everything myself because I couldn't afford to hire help yet. Marcus would come straight from school to the restaurant, doing his homework at a corner table, while I prepped for the dinner rush. He became my unofficial mascot, charming customers with his polite manners and bright smile. Regular patrons started asking for Marcus's table and would slip him quarters for helping clear plates or refill water glasses. Slowly, gradually, the restaurant began to succeed. Word spread about the homemade pies, the generous portions, the warm atmosphere where everyone was treated like family. Local business people started coming for lunch meetings. College students discovered our affordable daily specials. Families made us their go-to spot for birthday celebrations and anniversary dinners. Within a year, I was able to hire 2 part-time servers and a weekend cook. Within 2 years, I was looking at expanding the space. Marcus was proud of me in those days, and he wasn't shy about showing it. He'd tell his teachers that his mama owned the best restaurant in town. He'd bring friends by after school, showing off the place like it was a palace. When his class had career day, he insisted I come speak about being an entrepreneur, wearing my best dress and explaining to a room full of 9-year-olds how you could start with nothing and build something wonderful through hard work and determination. Those were golden years when Marcus and I were a team, when he understood that everything I was building was for both of us, for our future together. He'd help me count the register at closing time, carefully stacking bills and coins while I recorded the day's sales. He'd taste test new recipes and give me honest feedback with the seriousness of a professional food critic. When customers complimented the food or the service, he'd beam as if the praise was directed at him too, which in a way, it was. He was part of Beverly's kitchen as much as I was. I started putting money away for his college education, opening a savings account that I contributed to every month without fail. I had visions of him going to a good university, studying business or law or whatever captured his imagination, armed with opportunities I'd never had. I wanted him to know that he could be anything, do anything, because his mother had shown him what was possible when you refused to accept limitations. The restaurant continued to grow. By the time Marcus was in middle school, Beverly's Kitchen had become an institution in our small town. We were written up in the local newspaper, featured in a regional magazine's article about hidden gems. I was able to buy a small house with a real yard where Marcus could play, in a neighborhood with good schools and safe streets. For the first time in our lives, we had stability, security, a foundation that felt solid. Marcus was thriving, too. He made the honor roll consistently, played on the school soccer team, had a close group of friends who spent weekends at our house playing video games and eating everything in the refrigerator. I loved having them around, these gangly 12 and 13-year-olds who called me Mrs. Anderson and complimented my cooking and treated our home like a safe haven. Marcus would roll his eyes when I fussed over his friends, but I could tell. He was proud to have the house where everyone wanted to hang out. The mom who remembered everyone's favorite snacks and asked about their families and their dreams. Looking back now, I think those middle school years were when Marcus started to change, though the shift was so gradual I didn't recognize it at the time. Success has a way of altering your perspective, especially when you're young and haven't yet learned to appreciate the journey as much as the destination. As Beverly's Kitchen became more successful, as our lifestyle improved, as Marcus's world expanded beyond our little 2-person family, he began to take for granted things that had once felt like miracles. He stopped helping at the restaurant after school, preferring to go to friends' houses or stay home playing video games. When I asked him to come by for dinner, he'd complain that he was tired of restaurant food, that he wanted to eat at home, like a normal family. The phrase normal family stung more than he probably realized, because I'd worked so hard to give him exactly that, a stable home and a mother who was present and engaged in his life. But apparently normal meant something different to him than it did to me. The first crack in our foundation came during his 8th grade graduation dinner. I'd planned a special celebration at Beverly's Kitchen, inviting his friends and their families, preparing all his favorite dishes. I'd even had a custom cake made with his picture and "Congratulations, Marcus" written in blue frosting. But when the evening arrived, Marcus seemed embarrassed by the whole thing. He was polite to the guests but distant with me, as if he was already pulling away from the world we'd built together. After everyone left and we were cleaning up, I asked him if he'd had a good time. He shrugged and said, "It was fine, Mom. But next time, could we maybe just go to a real restaurant?" The words hit me like a physical blow. A real restaurant. As if Beverly's Kitchen, the place I'd built from nothing, The place that had given us everything we had wasn't real enough for him anymore. I should have addressed it then, should have sat him down and reminded him where we'd come from, what we'd built together, why it mattered. But I was tired and hurt, and I told myself it was just teenage attitude, something he'd grow out of. I told myself that success had spoiled him a little, but that was a good problem to have, wasn't it? Better than worrying about where the next meal was coming from or whether we could afford school supplies. High school brought new challenges and new distances between us. Marcus was accepted into the accelerated academic program, surrounded by kids whose parents were doctors and lawyers and business executives. Suddenly, our modest success seemed small in comparison to their inherited wealth and effortless privilege. Marcus started making comments about wanting to go to private school, about how the public school wasn't challenging enough, about how all his smart friends were planning to attend prestigious universities that cost more per year than I made in profit from the restaurant. I worked harder, expanded Beverly's Kitchen again, added catering services, started doing wedding receptions, and corporate events. The money was good, better than I'd ever imagined when I was slinging hash at Mel's Diner. But the work was consuming, demanding, and Marcus was old enough now that he didn't need me to pick him up from school or help with homework or tuck him in at night. Our conversations became functional, logistical. Did he need money for this? Could I drive him there? Would I be home for dinner, or should he order pizza? I told myself this was normal too, that teenagers were supposed to individuate, to become their own people separate from their parents. I told myself that the distance was temporary, that once he got through the normal rebellions of adolescence, we'd find our way back to each other. I told myself that the foundation we'd built in those early years was strong enough to weather this storm. I was wrong about that too. The first time Marcus expressed real shame about our life was during his junior year of high school. He'd been invited to a party at the home of one of his classmates, a girl named Chelsea whose father owned a chain of car dealerships across 3 counties. When I dropped him off, I couldn't help but stare at the house, a sprawling colonial with circular drive and professionally landscaped grounds. It was beautiful, intimidating, the kind of place I'd driven past 1,000 times but never imagined stepping foot inside. When I picked Marcus up later that night, he was quiet, almost sullen. I asked about the party, whether he'd had fun, if the parents were nice. He mumbled non-committal responses until finally, as we pulled into our own driveway, he said, "Mom, when people ask what you do for work, can you just say you're in food service? You don't have to mention that you own a restaurant." The words hung in the air between us like poison gas. Food service. As if Beverly's Kitchen was something to be ashamed of, something to hide. As if the work that had given him everything, the success I'd built with my own hands, the respect I'd earned in our community, was somehow embarrassing in front of his wealthy friends. I turned off the engine and looked at him in the dim light, from the porch. "Marcus, is there something wrong with owning a restaurant?" He sighed, the long-suffering exhale of a teenager who thinks his mother is being deliberately obtuse. "It's not wrong, Mom. It's just, these people's parents are lawyers and surgeons and business executives. They have, important jobs." Important jobs, as if feeding people, creating a gathering place for families, employing a dozen members of our community, building something from nothing wasn't important. As if the work that had lifted us out of poverty and given him opportunities wasn't worthy of respect. I wanted to argue with him, to remind him of all the lessons I'd taught him about hard work and dignity, and not judging people by their bank accounts. But I was too hurt, too stunned by his casual dismissal of everything I'd accomplished. So I just nodded and said, "Okay, honey, if that's what you prefer." That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and wondered when I'd become something my son was ashamed of. When had the woman who used to be his hero become an embarrassment? When had the life we'd built together become something he wanted to distance himself from? The answer, I was beginning to realize, was that success had changed Marcus in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not just financially, but socially, emotionally. He was moving in circles now where wealth was inherited, not earned, where status came, from family names and trust funds rather than personal achievement. In that world, a woman who'd pulled herself up from waitressing to restaurant ownership wasn't impressive. She was just new money, working class, someone who'd gotten lucky but didn't really belong. And Marcus, my brilliant, ambitious son, wanted desperately to belong in that world, even if it meant leaving me behind. But I still believed, in those days, that love would win out in the end. I still thought that the bond between us was stronger than teenage social pressures, that the foundation we'd built together would hold. I still had faith that my son, the little boy who'd once told everyone I was the smartest woman in the world, was still in there somewhere underneath the designer clothes and affected mannerisms he'd picked up from his wealthy friends. I was determined to keep fighting for him, to keep showing him that success earned through hard work was nothing to be ashamed of. That family loyalty mattered more than social status. I thought I had time to win him back, to remind him who we were and where we'd come from. I thought wrong. Senior year arrived with all the pomp and anxiety that comes with impending adulthood, and Marcus threw himself into college preparations, with the single-minded determination of someone trying to escape rather than simply move forward. Harvard, Yale, Princeton. These names rolled off his tongue like prayers, spoken with a reverence I'd never heard him use when talking about anything else, including our family or our business. He spent hours researching these institutions, memorizing statistics about acceptance rates and average SAT scores, studying photographs of ivy-covered buildings and manicured quads as if he were planning a pilgrimage to sacred ground. I supported his ambitions, of course. What mother wouldn't? Want her child to reach for the stars? But there was something different about the way Marcus pursued these dreams, something that felt less like aspiration and more like desperation. He wasn't just wanting to attend a prestigious university, he was wanting to become someone else, entirely. Someone whose mother didn't smell like French fry oil at the end of a long day, someone whose family history didn't include secondhand clothes and food stamps, and nights when dinner was cereal, because we couldn't afford groceries until the next paycheck. The college application process became a minefield of small rejections and careful omissions. When Marcus asked me to review his personal essay, I was excited to see how he'd tell our story, how he'd frame his journey from a single mother's struggling household to academic achievement. But as I read, my excitement curdled into something much darker. The essay was beautifully written, articulate, and compelling, but it told the story of a young man who'd overcome adversity through his own determination and intellectual gifts. I appeared only as background scenery, a vague figure who'd provided basic necessities while he'd essentially raised himself through sheer force of will. There was no mention of Beverly's kitchen, no acknowledgement of how the restaurant had transformed our lives, no recognition of the nights I'd stayed up late helping him with homework or the mornings I'd driven him to academic competitions across the state. According to his essay, he was a self-made success story, a brilliant mind that had flourished despite humble circumstances rather than because of his mother's love and sacrifice. When I gently questioned some of the omissions, suggesting that our partnership in building the restaurant might be worth mentioning, Marcus looked at me with barely concealed irritation. "Mom, college admissions officers want to see independence and personal growth. They don't want to read about family businesses or help from parents. They want to see that I can succeed on my own merit. On my own merit, as if everything he'd achieved had happened in a vacuum, as if the stable home I'd provided, the values I'd instilled, the opportunities I'd created through years of backbreaking work were somehow irrelevant to his success. As if acknowledging my role in his life would diminish rather than enhance his accomplishments. I swallowed my hurt and told him the essay was wonderful, which it was. Technically speaking, it was polished and sophisticated, exactly the kind of thing that would impress admissions committees at elite institutions. But it was also a careful erasure of our shared history, a strategic reimagining of his life that positioned him as the sole architect of his achievements. The college interviews were another source of tension. Marcus had been accepted for alumni, interviews at several schools, meetings with graduates who would assess his character and potential fit with their alma maters. He prepared for these conversations with the intensity of a political candidate, practicing answers to potential questions, researching the backgrounds of his interviewers, even going so far as to buy new clothes that would project the right image. When I offered to drive him to his first interview at a coffee shop downtown, he declined. "I'll take the bus, Mom. It'll look more independent." When I suggested we could grab lunch afterward to celebrate, he shook his head. "I'm meeting some friends from school. We're going to compare notes about our interviews." These small rejections accumulated like paper cuts, each one insignificant on its own, but cumulatively creating a wound that wouldn't heal. Marcus was systematically removing me from the important moments of his life, creating boundaries where none had existed before, building a wall between us that seemed to grow higher with each passing week. The worst part was how reasonable his explanations always sounded. Of course he needed to demonstrate independence to college admissions officers. Of course he wanted to process these important experiences with peers who were going through the same thing. Of course he was nervous about the interviews and needed space to prepare mentally. Every exclusion came wrapped in logic that made me feel petty and needy for wanting to be included. But beneath the reasonable explanations, I sensed something else: shame. Marcus was ashamed of me, of our life, of the journey we'd taken together. He'd decided that our story wasn't impressive enough for the world he wanted to enter, that my presence in his narrative would somehow diminish his chances of being accepted into the elite circles he was determined to join. The acceptance letters arrived in March, and Marcus's methodical preparation paid off. He was accepted to Princeton, his first choice, along with several other prestigious schools. I was genuinely thrilled for him, proud of his academic achievements, and excited about the opportunities that lay ahead. But even his moment of triumph was tinged with exclusion. He opened the Princeton letter alone in his room, and I only learned about his acceptance when I heard him on the phone with his guidance counselor, his voice bright with excitement and relief. When he finally came downstairs to share the news, his enthusiasm was more subdued, as if he'd already processed the most important emotions privately and was now offering me a polite, edited version of his joy. "That's wonderful, honey," I said, pulling him into a hug that he returned briefly, before stepping away. "We should celebrate. We could close the restaurant early tonight and go to that steakhouse you like, or have a party here with your friends." "Actually, Mom, Chelsea's parents are throwing a celebration dinner for all the kids who got into Ivy League schools. It's tonight at their country club." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "It's kind of a formal thing, for students and their families." "For students and their families, but apparently not for my family." "Oh," I said, trying to keep the disappointment out of my voice. "That sounds lovely. What time should I be ready?" Marcus shifted his weight, not meeting my eyes. "The thing is, it's really expensive, like $200 a plate, and it's mostly families who've been members of the country club for years. I just thought." He trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging between us like a sword. I understood what he wasn't saying. The country club celebration wasn't for people like us, for mothers who'd built their success from nothing, for families whose wealth was measured in years of hard work rather than generations of inherited privilege. I wasn't invited because I didn't belong in that world, and Marcus didn't want to bring me into a situation where our differences would be highlighted. "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. "You should definitely go. It sounds like a wonderful opportunity to celebrate with your classmates." "Thanks, Mom. I knew you'd understand." He looked relieved, as if he'd been bracing for an argument or tears. "Maybe we could do something tomorrow night, just the two of us?" But tomorrow night felt like a consolation prize, a lesser celebration. offered to make up for being excluded from the real one. I nodded and told him that sounded perfect, then excused myself to my bedroom where I could absorb the sting of rejection privately. That night, while Marcus was at the country club celebrating his acceptance to Princeton with families who'd never doubted their place in elite society, I sat in Beverly's kitchen after closing, surrounded by empty tables and the lingering smell of the day's specials. I thought about all the nights I'd worked late to save money for his college fund, all the dreams I'd nurtured about his future success, all the pride I'd felt watching him grow into the brilliant young man he'd become. I'd always imagined that when this moment came, when Marcus achieved the academic success we'd both worked toward, we'd celebrate together. I'd pictured us toasting his acceptance with champagne, calling relatives to share the good news, maybe even planning a special meal at the restaurant to mark the occasion with our extended family of employees and regular customers. I'd never imagined that his success would feel like the beginning of our separation rather than the culmination of our partnership. The summer before college was supposed to be a special time, a last chance to spend concentrated time together before Marcus left for Princeton. I'd planned to scale back my hours at the restaurant, maybe take a vacation together, help him prepare for this next chapter of his life. But Marcus had other plans. He'd gotten an internship at a prestigious law firm in the city, arranged through the father of one of his wealthy classmates, and he'd be spending most of the summer living in a furnished apartment near his workplace. "It's an incredible opportunity, Mom," he explained when he told me about the internship. "I'll be working with actual lawyers, sitting in on client meetings, getting real experience in corporate law. This could be huge for my resume." I was proud of his initiative, impressed that he'd secured such a competitive position. But I was also disappointed that he'd made these arrangements without discussing them with me, that he'd chosen to spend our last summer together in the city rather than at home. When I gently suggested that maybe he could commute from home, or work part-time so we could still have some time together, he looked at me as if I'd suggested he sabotage his own future. "Mom, this isn't some summer job at the restaurant. This is a professional opportunity with one of the most respected law firms in the state. I need to take it seriously, be fully committed. Living in the city is part of the experience." The comparison to some summer job at the restaurant stung more than he probably intended. Beverly's kitchen wasn't just a restaurant to me. It was the foundation of everything we'd built together, the source of his college fund, the place where he'd learned about work ethic and customer service and treating people with respect regardless of their economic status. But to Marcus, it had become a symbol of small-town limitations, something to be transcended rather than honored. He left for his internship in early June, promising to come home on weekends when his schedule allowed. The house felt enormous and empty without him, silent in ways that reminded me of those early days when he was small, and I'd sometimes feel the weight of single motherhood pressing down on me like a physical thing. But this emptiness was different, tinged with rejection rather than simple loneliness. Marcus did come home some weekends, but he was different during these visits, distracted and impatient, as if he was humoring me rather than genuinely wanting to spend time together. He'd sleep late, spend most of his waking hours on his phone or laptop, and seem eager to return to the city where his real life was apparently happening. When I suggested activities we used to enjoy together, cooking, elaborate meals, watching movies, visiting the farmer's market, he'd agree with the enthusiasm of someone checking items off a duty list. "How's the internship going?" I'd ask, genuinely interested in his experiences. "It's great, Mom. Really challenging. I'm learning so much about corporate law and client relations." His responses were polite but generic, the kind of updates you'd give to a distant relative rather than someone who'd invested 18 years in your development. "Are the other interns nice? Have you made friends?" "Yeah, they're cool. Most of them are from really good schools. Harvard, Yale, Princeton. It's nice to be around people who understand the academic pressure." People who understand the academic pressure. As if I hadn't been there for every late night of studying, every stress-induced breakdown over difficult assignments, every moment of doubt about whether he was smart enough or hardworking enough to achieve his goals. As if my support and encouragement over the years had been inadequate compared to the understanding he was finding among his privileged peers. The most painful conversation happened in late July, during one of his brief weekend visits. I'd made his favorite meal, pot roast with mashed potatoes and green beans, the comfort food he'd always requested when he was stressed or sad. As we sat at the kitchen table, I asked about his plans for the rest of the summer and the fall. Well, after the internship ends, I'll probably stay in the city for a few weeks. Some of the other interns are planning to do some traveling together before school starts. Then I'll need to get to Princeton early for orientation and freshman seminars. I set down my fork, processing what he was telling me. So you won't be coming home between the internship and school? Probably not, Mom. It just doesn't make sense logistically. Besides, I need to start getting used to being independent, right? College is going to be a big adjustment. Getting used to being independent. As if coming home to the place where he'd been loved and supported for 18 years would somehow handicap him in his transition to adulthood. As if maintaining a connection to his family was a weakness rather than a strength. Of course, I said, working to keep my voice steady. You're probably right. It's important to start that transition gradually. But inside, I was reeling. Marcus was essentially telling me that our relationship, our home, our shared history, was something he needed to practice living without. That independence meant separation from me rather than growing into a confident adult who maintained strong family bonds. After dinner, as he packed his things to return to the city, I stood in his doorway watching him fold clothes and gather belongings. The room that had been his sanctuary for so many years suddenly looked like a hotel room being vacated by a temporary guest. Most of his personal items, photos, books, mementos from his childhood, had already been packed away in boxes, as if he was systematically erasing evidence of his life here. Marcus, I said softly, you know you can always come home, right? No matter what happens, no matter how successful you become, this will always be your home. He looked up from his packing, and for just a moment, I saw a flicker of the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. But it was gone almost immediately, replaced by the polite distance that had become his default mode with me. I know, Mom. Thanks. He zipped up his bag and gave me a quick hug. I'll call you this week, okay? But the calls became less frequent as the summer progressed. When he did phone, our conversations were brief and superficial, filled with the kind of small talk you'd make with an acquaintance rather than intimate exchanges between mother and son. He'd ask about the restaurant, I'd ask about his work, and we'd both carefully avoid any topics that might lead to deeper emotional territory. I began to understand that Marcus wasn't just preparing to leave for college, he was practicing how to live without me. Each conversation, each visit, each interaction was an experiment in maintaining just enough connection to avoid being rude while establishing clear boundaries around how much of himself he was willing to share. The final weekend before he left for Princeton, Marcus came home to pack the last of his belongings and officially transition from living at home to being a college student who visited occasionally. I'd hoped this might be a chance for us to reconnect, to acknowledge the significance of this milestone and perhaps address the growing distance between us. Instead, it felt like a business transaction. Marcus moved through the house efficiently, sorting through possessions with the detached professionalism of someone conducting an estate sale. Keep, donate, throw away. Most of his childhood books went into the donation pile. Sports trophies from middle school throw away. Photos of the two of us from various restaurants and vacations over the years, packed away in a box that went directly into the basement storage room. Are you sure you don't want to take some of these photos? I asked, holding up a picture of us at Niagara Falls from a trip we'd taken when he was 14. We both looked happy, relaxed, genuinely enjoying each other's company. Nah, Mom. I don't really have space in my dorm room for a lot of personal stuff. Besides, I'll be making new memories at school. New memories at school. As if the 18 years of memories we'd created together were outdated inventory that needed to be cleared out to make room for better merchandise. I helped him load his car on Sunday morning, watching as the trunk filled with the carefully curated possessions he'd deemed worthy of his new life. Designer clothes purchased with money he'd earned at the internship, a new laptop, textbooks for his fall semester, a few tasteful decorative items that would help his dorm room project, the right image. Nothing that would immediately identify him as the son of a small-town restaurant owner, nothing that would connect him to the life we'd built together. As he prepared to drive away, I stood on the front porch fighting back tears. This should have been a proud moment, a celebration of his achievements and the opportunities that lay ahead. Instead, it felt like a funeral, like I was watching him bury the person he used to be in order to become someone new. "I'm so proud of you," I said, meaning it despite everything. "You're going to do amazing things at Princeton." "Thanks, Mom, for everything." He hugged me briefly, but it felt perfunctory, like he was checking off a final obligation before beginning his real life. As his car disappeared around the corner, I realized that Marcus had been systematically preparing for this moment for months, maybe years. He hadn't just been getting ready for college, he'd been getting ready to leave me behind. Every small rejection, every polite distance, every careful omission had been practice for this final separation. I went inside and walked through the empty house, seeing it now through his eyes, a small-town home that represented everything he wanted to escape, filled with reminders of a life he'd outgrown and a mother who no longer fit into his vision of himself. That night, I sat at the kitchen table where we'd shared so many meals and conversations over the years and wrote him a letter. I told him how proud I was of his achievements, how much I loved him, how excited I was about his future. I told him that home would always be here whenever he needed it, that our relationship didn't have to be a limitation on his success, but could be a source of strength and grounding as he navigated new challenges. I never sent the letter, because I was beginning to understand that Marcus didn't want my strength or grounding or unconditional love. He wanted distance, independence, the freedom to reinvent himself without the burden of his history or the expectations that came with being Beverly Anderson's son. He wanted to become someone else entirely, and apparently, that someone had no room in his life for the woman who'd raised him. Princeton transformed Marcus in ways I hadn't anticipated, though perhaps I should have seen it coming. When he called during his first semester, which wasn't often, his voice carried new inflections, subtle changes in pronunciation that made him sound like someone performing an accent rather than speaking naturally. He'd always been articulate, but now his speech had acquired a polished quality that felt rehearsed, as if he was constantly auditioning for acceptance into a world where his natural voice wasn't quite refined enough. Our phone conversations became exercises in careful choreography. He'd ask about the restaurant with the polite interest of someone making small talk with a distant acquaintance, and I'd share updates about new menu items or staff changes while sensing that he was only half listening. When I asked about his classes, his professors, his dorm mates, he'd provide sanitized summaries that revealed nothing about his actual experiences or emotions. It was like talking to a public relations representative for his own life. Thanksgiving break should have been a homecoming, a chance to reconnect after months apart. I spent days preparing his favorite foods, decorating the house with fall decorations, planning quiet activities that might help us bridge the gap that had grown between us. But when Marcus walked through the front door, he seemed like a guest, visiting someone else's home rather than a son returning to his childhood sanctuary. He'd grown thinner, and his clothes had evolved into a uniform of expensive casual wear that managed to look both effortless and precisely calculated. His hair was shorter, styled in a way that suggested regular visits to a salon rather than the barbershop in town where he'd gotten haircuts since elementary school. Even his posture had changed, straighter and more formal, as if he was perpetually conscious of being observed and judged. "The house looks exactly the same," he said, and something in his tone suggested this wasn't entirely a compliment. He moved through the familiar rooms like an anthropologist studying artifacts from a culture he'd once belonged to but had since transcended. Dinner that first night was stilted, filled with conversational gaps that I kept trying to fill with questions about his coursework, his professors, the other students in his program. Marcus answered dutifully but without enthusiasm, and I could see him checking his phone periodically, as if he was waiting for more important communications from his real life at school. "Tell me about your friends," I said, serving him a second helping of the lasagna he'd always loved. "Are you close with your roommate?" "Tyler's fine. His family has a house in the Hamptons. Really nice guy." He paused, cutting his food with unnecessary precision. "Actually, he invited me to spend Christmas break with them. They're going skiing in Aspen, then to their place in Florida for New Year's." My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. "Christmas break? But we always spend Christmas together. It's our tradition." Marcus didn't meet my eyes. "I know, Mom. But this is a really good opportunity. Tyler's father is a federal judge, and his uncle runs a major investment firm. The networking possibilities are incredible. Networking possibilities on Christmas. With strangers instead of the family who'd loved him unconditionally for 19 years. I set down my fork, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. "Of course you should go if it's important to you," I heard myself saying, though every word felt like swallowing glass. "We can celebrate when you get back." "Thanks, Mom. I knew you'd understand." That. His relief was palpable, and I realized he'd been bracing for an argument, prepared to defend his choice to spend the holidays with people he'd known for 3 months, instead of the mother who'd worked double shifts to pay for his childhood. Christmases. The rest of his Thanksgiving visit passed in a blur of polite interactions and careful distances. Marcus spent most of his time on his laptop, supposedly working on papers but frequently engaged in video calls with friends from school, conversations conducted in his new, polished voice that carried to where I sat in the kitchen. I caught fragments of discussions about spring break plans, internship applications, social events at school, all spoken in the tone of someone who belonged completely in that world. On Saturday morning, I suggested we visit Beverly's kitchen. Together, maybe have breakfast there like we used to when he was younger. Marcus agreed with the enthusiasm of someone consenting to a tedious obligation, and I could see him checking the time repeatedly as we sat in the corner booth where he'd done homework countless afternoons throughout high school. The staff was excited to see him, clustering around our table to ask about college, to tell him how proud they were of his achievements, to share updates about their own children and grandchildren. These were people who'd watched him grow up, who'd slipped him extra cookies when he was 8 and helped him with algebra when he was 13. They loved him genuinely, uncomplicated by social hierarchies or networking opportunities. But Marcus responded to their warmth with polite detachment, answering their questions with the same rehearsed responses he'd been giving me. When Rosa, our longtime cook, asked if he missed home cooking, he smiled and said college food was actually quite good, that the dining halls offered impressive variety. When Jimmy, our weekend server, asked if he was dating anyone special, Marcus deflected, with a comment about being too focused on academics for relationships. I watched him perform this careful dance of distance and realized that he wasn't just ashamed of me anymore. He was ashamed of everyone who represented his past, everyone who'd known him before he'd learned to edit himself for acceptance into elite society. These people loved him for who he'd been, but he was determined to become someone else entirely. After we left the restaurant, as we drove home through streets he'd walked and biked along for most of his life, Marcus was quiet. Finally, he said, "Mom, when people at school ask about home, What should I tell them about what you do?" The question hit me like a physical blow. We'd had this conversation before, years ago, but I'd hoped that maturity and distance might have given him some perspective on the value of honest work and authentic success. "You can tell them whatever feels right to you," I said carefully. "It's just that most of my friends' parents are in finance or law or medicine. Professional careers, you know. The restaurant thing is harder to explain." The restaurant thing, as if Beverly's Kitchen was some embarrassing hobby rather than a successful business that had provided for his every need and opportunity. As if building something from nothing was less impressive than inheriting a trust fund or following a predetermined path into elite professions. "You could tell them I'm an entrepreneur," I suggested, "that I built a successful food service business from the ground up." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, that sounds good. Entrepreneur is better." "Better than what? Better than restaurant owner? Better than the truth?" I wanted to ask him when honesty about our life had become something that needed improvement, when the story of our journey together had become insufficient for the world he was trying to enter. That Sunday, as I helped him pack for his return to school, I found myself looking at him as if he was a stranger. This polished, careful young man bore only surface resemblance to the boy who'd once been my closest companion, my partner in building our life together. That boy had been proud of our restaurant, excited about our success, protective of our relationship. This young man was systematically erasing all evidence of that boy's existence. When he left for school after that Thanksgiving visit, I stood on the porch waving goodbye and felt something die inside me. Not love exactly, because I would always love Marcus with the fierce protectiveness of a mother. But hope. Hope that we might find our way back to each other, that his college experience might teach him to value authenticity over status, that distance might help him appreciate what we'd built together rather than take it for granted. Christmas was the loneliest day of my life. I'd spent decades creating holiday traditions around Marcus, building memories through elaborate meals and thoughtful gifts and quiet moments of connection. Without him, Christmas felt hollow, pointless, like performing a play for an empty theater. I went through the motions of celebration, opening the single gift I'd bought for myself, cooking a small meal that I barely touched, watching holiday movies that reminded me of better times. Marcus called that evening, a brief check-in from Tyler's family's house in Aspen. He sounded happy, energized by the skiing and the social activities, surrounded by laughter and conversation from his new chosen family. He asked how my day had been, and I lied and said it was lovely, that I'd had a quiet but pleasant celebration. I didn't tell him about the hours I'd spent crying, about the way his empty chair at the dinner table had felt like an accusation, about how completely I'd failed to matter enough for him to want to be here. Spring semester brought new disappointments and fresh rejections. Marcus had pledged a fraternity, one of the most exclusive on campus, and his letters and calls were filled with references to social events and traditions that seemed designed to separate the truly elite from those who merely aspired to join their ranks. He described elaborate formal dinners, networking events with alumni who held powerful positions in government and industry, spring break trips to private islands owned by fraternity brothers' families. When I asked about the cost of these activities, suggesting that maybe I could help with expenses, Marcus assured me that everything was covered by the fraternity's social fund, supported by wealthy alumni and parents. He didn't need financial help from me anymore, had apparently found patrons who could provide opportunities I never could have imagined. The rejection stung, but what hurt more was the implication that these strangers' generosity was superior to my support, that being sponsored by elite networks was preferable to accepting help from family. Marcus was learning to be comfortable with charity from the wealthy, while growing increasingly uncomfortable with anything that connected him to his working-class origins. Spring break came and went without a visit home. Marcus had been invited to join a group of fraternity brothers on a sailing trip through the Caribbean, an opportunity he described as too valuable to pass up. When I suggested that maybe he could come home for even a few days, he explained that the trip was educational, as well as social, that he'd be networking with successful alumni and learning about international business practices. Everything in Marcus's life had apparently become educational and networking focused. Every experience justified through its potential to advance his career prospects rather than its intrinsic value or the relationships it might strengthen. He was living his life like a strategic campaign for future success, with no room for sentiment or family loyalty or simple human connection. Summer arrived with the promise of Marcus returning home for a longer stay, and I allowed myself to hope that time away from the pressure cooker environment of Princeton might help him remember who he'd been before he'd learned to be ashamed of his roots. But those hopes were quickly dashed when he announced that he'd secured another internship, this one at a prestigious investment firm in Manhattan, arranged through connections he'd made at school. "This is even better than last summer, Mom," he explained during one of our increasingly rare phone calls. "I'll be working directly with portfolio managers, learning about high-level financial strategies, and the networking opportunities are incredible." Always the networking opportunities, always the career advancement, never the simple pleasure of being home, of reconnecting with family, of remembering where he'd come from and who had loved him first. The summer internship came with an apartment share in Manhattan, splitting expenses with other interns from elite schools who were all following similar trajectories toward careers in finance or law or consulting. Marcus would be living in a different world entirely, surrounded by young people who took wealth and privilege for granted, who saw summer internships at prestigious firms as birthright rather than extraordinary opportunity. He came home for exactly 3 days between finishing his sophomore year and starting the internship, just long enough to pick up summer clothes and handle some administrative details. During those 3 days, I barely saw him. He spent most of his time on the phone with friends from school, making plans for weekends in the Hamptons, discussing apartments they might share during their junior year, comparing notes about their respective internships and the contacts they hoped to cultivate. When I tried to engage him in conversation about his experiences, his thoughts about his education, his plans for the future, he gave me the same polite but distant responses I'd been receiving for months. It was as if he'd developed a separate personality for dealing with me, one that was dutiful but completely superficial, designed to fulfill his obligations as my son, while revealing nothing about his authentic thoughts or feelings. The breaking point came on his last morning at home. I'd gotten up early to make him a special breakfast, all his childhood favorites, hoping we might have one genuine conversation before he left for the summer. As I set the table with the good dishes and arranged fresh flowers in a vase, I felt foolishly optimistic that food and attention might break through the wall he'd built between us. Marcus came downstairs already dressed for travel, checking his phone as he walked into the kitchen. He glanced at the elaborate breakfast spread with what might have been embarrassment rather than appreciation. "Mom, you didn't need to do all this. I'm not really that hungry, and I need to get on the road pretty soon." "I thought we could have a nice breakfast together before you leave," I said, hearing the pleading note in my own voice and hating it. "We haven't had much time to talk since you've been home." He sat down reluctantly and accepted a small portion of scrambled eggs, picking at them while scrolling through messages on his phone. I tried to start conversations about his summer plans, about his coursework for the fall, about anything that might prompt him to engage with me as something more than an obligation to be endured. Finally, in desperation, I said, "Marcus, I feel like we're becoming strangers. I miss talking to you, really talking. I miss feeling like I know what's happening in your life." He looked up from his phone with visible irritation. "Mom, I'm fine. Everything's fine. You don't need to worry about me or try to manage my life anymore. I'm an adult now. I'm not trying to manage your life. I just want to be part of it." "You are part of it," he said, but his tone suggested otherwise. "Just because I'm not here all the time doesn't mean we're not close." But we weren't close, and we both knew it. We were polite strangers who shared a history, going through the motions of a relationship that had been hollowed out from the inside. "Sometimes I feel like you're ashamed of me," I said quietly, immediately regretting the vulnerability, but unable to hold back the words any longer. Marcus set down his fork and looked at me with something that might have been pity. "Mom, this isn't about you. This is about me building my own life, becoming independent. You can't take everything so personally." Everything so personally. As if my son's systematic rejection of our shared history, his careful omission of my role in his success, his obvious discomfort with everything I represented was somehow not personal. As if love itself wasn't personal. "I've worked so hard to give you opportunities," I continued, knowing I was making a mistake but unable to stop myself. "I've sacrificed everything so you could have choices I never had. I just want to feel like that means something to you." "Of course it means something," he said, but his voice carried the tone of someone humoring an unreasonable person. "I'm grateful for everything you've done, but that doesn't mean I owe you my entire life. I have to make my own way now." Making his own way apparently meant pretending he'd emerged fully formed from elite society, rather than acknowledging the working class mother who'd loved and supported him for 20 years. It meant treating our relationship as a burden to be managed, rather than a foundation to be honored. After he left that morning, I sat in the kitchen staring at the untouched breakfast I'd prepared with such hope. The eggs had grown cold, the bacon congealed in its own grease, the fresh flowers already beginning to wilt in the summer heat. It felt like a metaphor for our relationship, all my efforts to nourish and beautify something that was already dying. That summer was the longest of my life. Marcus called sporadically, always briefly, always with the distracted air of someone checking an item off a to-do list. His updates were generic and impersonal. The internship was going well, he was learning a lot. The other interns were smart and ambitious. When I asked specific questions about his work or his living situation, he deflected with vague responses that revealed nothing about his actual experiences. I started to understand that Marcus wasn't just building independence. He was building a completely separate identity that had no room for the life we'd shared together. He was becoming someone who'd never lived above a laundromat, never worried about grocery money, never had a mother who smelled like kitchen grease and counted tips at the end of a long shift. He was erasing me from his story not out of malice, but out of necessity, because acknowledging his origins would complicate the persona he was constructing for acceptance into elite society. Fall semester of his junior year brought new depths of rejection. Marcus had been selected for a prestigious study abroad program in London, an opportunity that would keep him away for the entire academic year. He presented this news as a career milestone rather than a personal choice, emphasizing the academic prestige and networking opportunities while glossing over the fact that it meant we wouldn't see each other for nearly 12 months. "This is exactly the kind of thing that sets candidates apart when they're applying for jobs in international finance," he explained during one of our brief phone calls. "The connections I'll make in London could be invaluable for my future. Always the future, always the career. Never the present moment or the relationships that had shaped him or the people who continued to love him despite his determined distance." When I asked if he'd considered declining the opportunity so we could spend more time together during his college years, he responded with barely concealed impatience. "Mom, you can't seriously expect me to turn down something like this for sentimental reasons. This is my career we're talking about. Sentimental reasons. As if our relationship was nothing more than nostalgia. As if 20 years of love and sacrifice was sentiment that had no place in serious decision-making about his future." The final blow came in November, during a brief phone call that I initially thought might be good news because it was longer than our usual conversations, and Marcus seemed genuinely excited about something. "I have incredible news, Mom," he said, his voice carrying more enthusiasm than I'd heard in months. "Tyler's family has invited me to spend Christmas with them again, but this time in Switzerland. His father has business interests there, and I'll be able to meet some really influential people in international banking. Christmas in Switzerland, with strangers. Again. While his mother spent the holiday alone, wondering when she'd become so thoroughly irrelevant to her son's life, that he could announce these plans with excitement rather than guilt. "That sounds wonderful," I managed to say, though my voice came out smaller than I'd intended. "I'm so grateful for opportunities like this," Marcus continued, apparently oblivious to my reaction. "Tyler's family has really taken me under their wing. They treat me like I'm part of the family. Part of their family, because apparently his actual family wasn't sufficient for his needs anymore. Apparently the love and loyalty I'd offered unconditionally for 20 years was less valuable than the conditional acceptance he'd found among people who would drop him the moment he ceased to be useful or entertaining. After that conversation, I sat in my empty house and finally acknowledged what had been building for months. Marcus was gone. Not just physically, not just temporarily, but permanently. The son I'd raised, the boy who'd once thought I was the most important person in his world, had been systematically replaced by a young man who saw me as an obstacle to overcome, rather than a relationship to cherish. I'd lost him not to tragedy or conflict, but to ambition and shame. He'd decided that success required erasing his past, that achievement meant disconnecting from anything that didn't enhance his prospects for acceptance into elite circles. I'd become a liability in his carefully constructed narrative about himself, evidence of origins that didn't fit the image he was cultivating. That night, for the first time in years, I allowed myself to cry without restraint. I cried for the little boy who'd wrapped his arms around my legs and announced his intention to marry me. I cried for the teenager who'd helped me count the register at Beverly's Kitchen and beamed with pride when customers complimented our food. I cried for all the dreams I'd had about our future relationship, the plans I'd made for staying close as he became an adult, the grandchildren I'd imagined spoiling, while he rolled his eyes affectionately at my excessive love. I cried for the mother I'd been, the woman who'd believed that love was enough, that sacrifice would be recognized and honored, that building a good life together meant building a permanent bond. I'd been wrong about all of it. When the tears finally stopped, I felt empty but also strangely clear. Marcus had made his choice and it was time for me to make mine. I couldn't keep offering my heart to someone who saw it as an embarrassment. I couldn't keep hoping for reconciliation with someone who wanted separation. I couldn't keep trying to maintain a relationship with someone who'd already moved on. It was time to let go. Not just of Marcus, but of the version of myself that had existed primarily to serve his needs and dreams. It was time to figure out who Beverly Anderson was when she wasn't defined by her role as Marcus's mother. It was time to remember that I'd built something valuable before he was born, and I could build something valuable again, with or without his appreciation or approval. The woman who'd survived single motherhood and poverty and built a successful business from nothing still existed somewhere inside me. It was time to find her again. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in January, 3 weeks after Marcus had spent Christmas skiing in Switzerland with Tyler's family instead of coming home. I was reviewing beverage orders for Beverly's Kitchen when my attorney, Patricia Henley, called with news that would change everything I thought I knew about my own life. "Beverly, I need you to come in as soon as possible," Patricia said, her voice carrying an urgency I'd never heard before. "I've received some documents that require immediate attention. How quickly can you get here?" Patricia had been handling my business affairs for over a decade, and she wasn't prone to dramatics. When she used that tone, it meant something significant had happened. I told her I'd be there within the hour, grabbed my coat, and drove downtown to her office with my mind racing through possibilities. Tax issues? Problems with the restaurant's licensing? Some kind of legal challenge I wasn't aware of? Patricia's office occupied the 3rd floor of a restored Victorian building, all mahogany paneling and leather-bound law books that conveyed serious competence without unnecessary pretension. She'd represented me through the expansion of Beverly's kitchen, helped me navigate various business challenges, and had become something of a friend over the years. Today, however, she greeted me with uncharacteristic solemnity. "Sit down, Beverly. What I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to process." She opened a thick manila folder and withdrew several documents, spreading them across her desk like evidence in a criminal case. Bank statements, legal correspondence, certified letters bearing official seals. My name appeared on many of them, but the amounts and account numbers were completely unfamiliar. "These arrived yesterday from the office of Harrison Walsh & Associates in Manhattan," Patricia began. "They're executors for the estate of Eleanor Whitman. Does that name mean anything to you?" I shook my head. "I've never heard of her." Patricia nodded grimly. "That's what I expected. Eleanor Whitman died 6 months ago at the age of 87. According to these documents, she was your biological grandmother." The words hung in the air like a foreign language I couldn't quite translate. Biological grandmother. But my mother had died when I was 3, and I'd been raised by my father, who'd always told me that both sides of our family were gone, that we were on our own in the world. It was one of the reasons I'd worked so hard to build a strong relationship with Marcus, to create the family connections that I'd never had growing up. "That's impossible," I said slowly. "My father told me my mother's family had all passed away before I was born." Patricia's expression grew even more serious. "According to the estate documents, Eleanor Whitman spent 37 years searching for you. She hired private investigators, worked with adoption agencies, contacted genealogy services. She only found you 18 months ago." The room seemed to tilt slightly, and I gripped the arms of my chair to steady myself. "Found me? What do you mean, found me?" "Beverly, your father apparently told your grandmother that you died in the same accident that killed your mother. She's been mourning you for over 50 years. The implications of what Patricia was saying crashed over me like cold water. My father had lied to me about having no family, and he'd lied to my grandmother about my death. For decades, this woman had believed I was dead while I'd believed she didn't exist. "Why would he do something like that?" I whispered. Patricia consulted another document. "Based on the correspondence Eleanor's attorneys have provided, it appears your father and your mother's family had a significant falling out after your mother's death. There was a custody dispute, accusations about your father's fitness as a parent, threats of legal action. Rather than fight for custody, your father disappeared with you and allowed everyone to believe you'd died." My head was spinning. Everything I'd believed about my origins, my family history, my place in the world, was suddenly revealed to be a carefully constructed lie. I wasn't alone in the world. I'd never been alone. There had been someone looking for me, mourning me, hoping against hope that I might somehow still be alive. "What else do the documents say?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I was ready for more revelations. Patricia turned to another page. Eleanor Whitman was quite wealthy. She never married, never had other children. She built a successful textile business in New York, accumulated significant real estate holdings, maintained diverse investment portfolios. When she died, her estate was valued at approximately $14 million. $14 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, meaningless. I'd spent my entire adult life worrying about money, counting every dollar, working endless hours to build modest security for Marcus and myself. And all that time, there had been a grandmother I'd never known who had enough wealth to solve every financial concern I'd ever had. "The cruel irony," Patricia continued, "is that Eleanor spent the last 18 months of her life trying to figure out how to contact you. She'd finally tracked you down through public records, found out about Beverly's kitchen, learned about Marcus. She was planning to reach out to you directly when she had a stroke." I closed my eyes, trying to absorb the magnitude of what I'd lost. Not just the money, though that was staggering, But the relationship. I could have known my grandmother. I could have learned about my mother from someone who'd loved her. Marcus could have had a great-grandmother who would have been proud of his achievements without shame or reservation. There's more, Patricia said gently. According to her will, Eleanor left everything to you, the entire estate. But there's a specific provision that's particularly relevant to your current situation. She handed me a copy of the will, pointing to a highlighted section. I read it slowly, hardly believing the words on the page. In the event that my granddaughter Beverly has children who have reached the age of majority, she may, at her sole discretion, distribute portions of this inheritance to them. However, any such distribution must be contingent upon those children demonstrating genuine love, respect, and loyalty to their mother. I do not wish my legacy to benefit individuals who would take advantage of Beverly's generosity or treat her with anything less than the honor she deserves. I read the passage twice, then looked up at Patricia in amazement. How could she have known to include something like that? The private investigators she hired were very thorough, Patricia explained. They provided her with detailed reports about your life, your business, your relationship with Marcus. She knew about his college expenses, his social aspirations, his increasing distance from you. Eleanor was apparently quite concerned about how he was treating you. A bitter laugh escaped my throat. A woman I never met cared more about how Marcus treated me than he did. Patricia nodded sympathetically. There's more. Eleanor left specific instructions about how the inheritance should be handled. She wanted you to have time to observe Marcus's behavior as an adult before making any decisions about including him in the legacy. She was very clear that the money should only go to family members who truly valued you. The irony was breathtaking. For months, I'd been mourning the loss of my relationship with Marcus, feeling like I'd failed as a mother because I couldn't earn his respect or maintain his love. Meanwhile, a grandmother I'd never known had been watching from afar, recognizing his behavior for what it was and taking steps to protect me from being taken advantage of. When do I gain access to the inheritance? I asked. Immediately. The estate has been in probate for 6 months, but everything is now finalized. There are several bank accounts, investment portfolios, real estate properties in Manhattan and the Hamptons, plus some valuable artwork and jewelry. The attorneys in New York can arrange transfers as soon as you're ready. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of this revelation. In a single conversation, I'd gone from feeling like an aging woman whose life's work wasn't appreciated by her only child to discovering that I was the heir to a substantial fortune, left by someone who'd valued me enough to try to protect me from ungrateful family members. Patricia, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. Based on what you know about Marcus's behavior, do you think he would treat me differently if he knew about this money? Patricia was quiet, for a long moment, considering her words carefully. Beverly, you know I'm fond of Marcus. I've watched him grow up, celebrated his achievements. But based on what you've told me about his recent behavior, and given what I observed during his last visit to review his college paperwork, she trailed off, but I could see the truth in her expression. You think he'd suddenly be interested in our relationship again? I said. I think he'd be very interested in maintaining a good relationship with his mother if he knew she'd inherited $14 million. The confirmation of what I'd already suspected hit me like a physical blow. My own attorney, someone who'd known Marcus since he was a child, believed he was capable of that kind of calculated manipulation, that he would fake affection for financial gain rather than offer genuine love and respect. What are my options? I asked. Patricia leaned back in her chair. Legally, you can do whatever you want with the money. Eleanor's will gives you complete discretion. You could give Marcus half immediately. You could set up a trust fund for his future children. You could donate everything to charity, or you could keep it all for yourself. The choice is entirely yours. And if I choose to test him somehow? to see what kind of person he really is? That's completely within your rights. In fact, given Eleanor's concerns, it might be exactly what she hoped you'd do. I spent the rest of that afternoon in Patricia's office, reviewing documents and trying to understand the full scope of what I'd inherited. The money was staggering, but it was the real estate that truly amazed me. Eleanor had owned a townhouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan worth several $1,000,000, plus a summer estate in the Hamptons that could only be described as magnificent. There were also investment properties, stocks, bonds, artwork by recognized masters, jewelry that had been appraised for insurance purposes at hundreds of thousands of dollars. But more than the wealth itself, it was the evidence of Eleanor's character that moved me most deeply. The private investigator reports painted a picture of a woman who'd spent decades searching for the granddaughter she'd believed was dead, never giving up hope, never stopping her efforts to find some trace of me. When she'd finally located me, she'd spent months learning about my life, understanding my struggles, recognizing my achievements. In the margins of the reports, there were handwritten notes in Eleanor's careful script. Beverly shows remarkable strength and determination. She's built something impressive from nothing. Marcus seems ungrateful for his mother's sacrifices. I worry that he takes advantage of her generosity. This woman I'd never met had seen and appreciated things about me that my own son couldn't recognize. She'd understood my worth when Marcus was learning to be ashamed of it. She'd valued my achievements when he was dismissing them as embarrassing, limitations on his social advancement. That evening, I sat in my quiet house and made a decision. I wouldn't tell Marcus about the inheritance immediately. Instead, I would wait and see how he chose to treat me as his life continued to evolve. If he could find his way back to treating me with genuine love and respect, if he could remember the value of family loyalty and authentic relationships, then Eleanor's legacy would benefit him. But if he continued down his current path of calculated distance and social climbing, if he kept treating me like an inconvenient reminder of origins he wanted to forget, then he would never know what he'd lost. Eleanor had given me something far more valuable than money. She'd given me power. The power to be valued appropriately, to demand respect, to refuse to accept treatment that diminished my worth. For too long, I'd been begging for crumbs of attention from someone who should have been grateful for my love. Now I could afford to wait for something better. The next few weeks passed in a surreal haze of financial consultations and legal arrangements. I opened new bank accounts, met with investment advisors, toured properties I now owned but had never seen. The townhouse in Manhattan was breathtaking, filled with antiques and artwork that spoke of Eleanor's sophisticated taste and careful curation. The Hamptons estate was even more impressive, sprawling grounds overlooking the ocean, gardens maintained by professional landscapers, rooms filled with comfortable elegance. I found photographs of my mother throughout Eleanor's homes, images I'd never seen before that showed her as a young woman, laughing and vibrant and beautiful. There were also albums documenting Eleanor's business success, her travels, her friendships, the full life she'd built while mourning a granddaughter she'd believed was dead. In Eleanor's study, I discovered a letter addressed to me that her attorneys had missed during the initial estate review. It was sealed in an envelope with my name written in the same careful script I'd seen in the investigator reports. "My dearest Beverly," it began. "If you are reading this, then the investigators were successful in finding you, and I have passed away before we could meet. I cannot adequately express my grief over the lost years, the time we should have spent together, the relationship that was stolen from us by circumstances I still don't fully understand. I want you to know that discovering you were alive was the greatest joy of my final years. Learning about your strength, your business success, your dedication to your son filled me with pride and love. You are everything I had hoped you would become, and more. I have watched from afar as your son has begun to distance himself from you, and it breaks my heart. I recognize the pattern because I have seen it many times in my business dealings. People of weak character often become ashamed of those who helped them achieve success, preferring to reinvent their stories to make themselves appear more impressive. I do not want my legacy to reward such behavior. You have earned respect through your hard work and sacrifice. You deserve to be treated with love and honor, not taken for granted or dismissed. Use this inheritance wisely, but more importantly, use it to ensure that you are valued appropriately by those who claim to love you. You are worthy of authentic relationships, genuine appreciation, and unconditional love. Never settle for less. With all my love and admiration, your grandmother Eleanor. I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face. This woman who'd never been allowed to know me had somehow understood my situation better than anyone in my life. She'd seen through Marcus's behavior to the heart of what was happening, and she'd given me the tools to address it. Meanwhile, Marcus continued his pattern of minimal contact. He called once in February briefly to mention that he was considering staying in London for the summer to take additional courses and intern with a banking firm there. He presented this as an academic opportunity, but I could hear the underlying message. He had no intention of coming home, no desire to spend time with me, no interest in maintaining more than the most superficial connection to his family. That sounds like a wonderful opportunity, I said, though the words tasted like ashes. I'm glad you understand, Mom. I know some parents would be disappointed, but I knew you'd see the career benefits. Some parents would be disappointed, as if my feelings were an unreasonable obstacle to his ambitions, rather than the natural response of a mother who missed her son and wanted to maintain a meaningful relationship with him. After that call, I made another decision. It was time to test Marcus more directly, to see exactly how much our relationship meant to him when it wasn't convenient or advantageous. I had an idea that would reveal his true character once and for all. I called him the following week, with a request that would seem reasonable to someone who genuinely cared about me, but burdensome to someone who saw me only as an obligation. Marcus, I've been thinking about visiting you in London, I said. I could come for a long weekend, maybe see some sights, take you to dinner. It's been so long since we've spent quality time together. There was a pause that lasted just a moment too long. Oh, Mom, that's really sweet. But my schedule is incredibly busy right now. Between classes and the internship, I barely have time to sleep. Plus, my living situation is pretty cramped. I'm sharing a tiny flat with 3 other guys. I just don't think the timing would work out. I could stay in a hotel, I offered. I wouldn't need to take up much of your time, maybe just one dinner together. It's not just the time, Mom. It's that my whole routine here is focused on academics and networking. Having family visit it would just complicate things socially. You understand, right? I understood perfectly. Having his working-class mother show up in London would complicate his carefully constructed image among his wealthy classmates. I would be evidence of origins that didn't fit the persona he was, cultivating among the international elite. Of course I understand, I said. I wouldn't want to complicate anything for you. Thanks, Mom. I knew you'd get it. Maybe when I'm back in the States, we can plan something. But we both knew he wouldn't be planning anything. This was just another polite deflection, another way of maintaining distance while avoiding the guilt of outright rejection. After that conversation, I knew exactly what I needed to do. Eleanor had been right about Marcus's character, and it was time to take action that would either wake him up to what he was losing or reveal definitively that he was beyond redemption. I began making preparations for a test that would show Marcus exactly what authentic family loyalty looked like and what happened when you took the people who loved you for granted. It was time for him to learn that actions had consequences and that treating family like disposable conveniences came with a price. Eleanor had given me the power to choose how I wanted to be treated. Now it was time to exercise that power. The plan I developed was simple, but comprehensive. I would create a situation that would reveal Marcus's true priorities while giving him every opportunity to demonstrate genuine care for our relationship. If he passed the test, he would benefit from Eleanor's legacy. If he failed, he would discover what it felt like to lose something precious through his own choices. I started by calling him with what appeared to be devastating news. "Marcus, I need to tell you something important," I said when he answered his phone on a sunny Thursday afternoon in London. "I've been having some health issues, and the doctors want to run some serious tests." It wasn't entirely a lie. I had been feeling more tired than usual, probably from the stress of managing the inheritance and dealing with the emotional aftermath of discovering my family history. But I presented the situation as potentially more serious than it probably was. "Health issues?" Marcus said, and I listened carefully to his tone, hoping to hear genuine concern. "Some concerning symptoms, fatigue, some chest pain. They want to do cardiac tests, maybe some imaging. I'm probably overreacting, but the doctors seem worried enough to want immediate attention." I waited for him to offer to come home, to ask if I needed help navigating the medical system, to show some sign that my well-being mattered to him more than his social calendar in London. Instead, he said, "That sounds scary, Mom, but I'm sure it's nothing serious. You've always been really healthy. The doctors are probably just being cautious." Just being cautious. As if serious health concerns were something to be minimized rather than taken seriously. As if his mother potentially facing cardiac issues wasn't worth more than casual reassurance. "I hope you're right," I said. "It's just frightening to face something like this alone." Another pause, another opportunity for him to offer support, to suggest coming home, to prioritize our relationship over his internship and social networking. "You're not alone, Mom. You have the staff at the restaurant and Patricia to help with legal stuff if you need it. Plus, the doctors here will take good care of you. Try not to worry too much." Try not to worry too much about potentially serious heart problems that I would be facing by myself while my only child pursued networking opportunities on another continent. "You're right," I said. "I'm sure everything will be fine. I'm glad you're being sensible about it. Let me know how the tests go, okay?" Let me know how the tests go, like I was updating him on a minor inconvenience rather than potentially life-threatening health issues. The casual tone of his response told me everything I needed to know about how much our relationship truly meant to him. Over the following weeks, I continued to test his priorities with increasingly serious updates about my fictional health crisis. Each conversation revealed new depths of his self-absorption and emotional distance. When I told him the doctors had found some concerning irregularities and wanted to schedule surgery, he responded by asking if I could postpone the procedure until after his summer internship ended, because he was hoping to bring some of his new friends home to visit and wanted me to be available to help with arrangements. When I mentioned feeling overwhelmed by medical bills and insurance complications, he suggested I might want to take out a loan against the restaurant rather than interfere with his education expenses. When I said I was scared about the surgery and feeling isolated, he reminded me that he was in the middle of final exams and couldn't really handle additional stress right now. Each response was worse than the last, revealing a young man who had become so completely self-centered that he couldn't recognize his mother's genuine need for support and comfort. Marcus had become someone who saw family relationships as existing solely for his benefit, to be utilized when convenient and ignored when they interfered with his ambitions. The final test came in early June, when I called him with what I presented as a crisis that required immediate family support. "Marcus, I need you to come home," I said, making my voice sound smaller and more frightened than usual. The surgery didn't go as well as expected. There were complications. I'm going to be hospitalized for several weeks, and I need help managing things while I recover. This was the moment of truth. Either he would recognize that some things were more important than internships and social opportunities, or he would reveal once and for all that he had no capacity for genuine family loyalty. "Oh no, Mom, that's terrible." His voice carried what sounded like genuine distress, and for a moment I hoped I'd been wrong about the depth of his selfishness. "How serious are the complications?" "Serious enough that I can't live alone right now. I need someone here to help with medical appointments, to manage the restaurant while I'm recovering, to just be present in case something goes wrong." I waited. This was his chance to step up, to show that he understood what family meant, to demonstrate that he could put someone else's needs ahead of his own ambitions. "Mom, I wish I could help, but you know I can't just leave London right now. This internship is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. If I abandon it now, it could ruin my chances of getting offers from major firms next year." Ruin his chances. As if his mother's medical crisis was less important than maintaining his position in the competition for prestigious job offers. "Marcus, I'm scared," I said honestly. "I don't know what's going to happen, and I've never felt so alone." "I understand that you're scared, but you're being dramatic. You have doctors taking care of the medical stuff, and you can hire help for everything else. This isn't the kind of emergency that requires family to drop everything and rush home. This isn't the kind of emergency that requires family to drop everything. My hospitalization, my fear, my need for support from the only family I had left in the world wasn't sufficient to interrupt his networking schedule." "I see," I said quietly. "Look, I feel bad that you're going through this, but I can't sacrifice my entire future because you're having medical problems. That's not fair to ask of me." It's not fair to ask of me. The son whose education I'd funded, whose dreams I'd supported, whose success I'd prioritized above my own needs for 20 years, was telling me it wasn't fair to ask him to come home when I was hospitalized and afraid. "You're right," I said. "I shouldn't have asked. I'm glad you understand. I promise I'll come visit as soon as my internship ends. Maybe in August if my schedule permits." If his schedule permits, to visit his mother recovering from serious surgery. After that conversation, I sat in Eleanor's Manhattan townhouse, where I'd been staying while supposedly in the hospital, and felt something cold and final settle in my chest. Marcus had failed every test, rejected every opportunity to show genuine care, prioritized his ambitions over my well-being at every turn. He wasn't the son I'd raised. That boy, the one who'd wrapped his arms around my legs and announced his love for me, was gone. In his place was a calculating young man who saw relationships as transactions, who would only invest in people who could advance his interests. It was time for Marcus to learn that actions have consequences, and that some losses are permanent. Marcus returned from London in late August with the confident swagger of someone who believed he'd successfully navigated another step toward his predetermined destiny. His year abroad had polished him even further, adding European sophistication to his already carefully cultivated persona. When he called to let me know he was back in the States, his voice carried the casual tone of someone checking in with a distant relative rather than reconnecting with his mother after a year of separation. "I'm back at Princeton getting ready for senior year," he said, as if this was news I should be grateful to receive. The London program was incredible. I made connections with some major players in international finance. My resume is going to be absolutely untouchable when I start interviewing for positions after graduation. "That's wonderful, honey," replied, keeping my voice neutral. "I'm glad it was such a valuable experience for you." "How are you feeling, by the way?" he asked, almost as an afterthought. "You mentioned some health issues before I left." This was my opening, the moment I'd been preparing for during the long months of his absence. "Actually, Marcus, I've been meaning to talk to you about that. Could you come home this weekend? There are some things we need to discuss in person." "Home?" He sounded genuinely surprised, as if the concept of visiting his childhood house was foreign to him. "Mom, I'm really swamped with senior year preparation. Interviews with investment firms start in a few weeks, and I need to be completely ready. Can't we just talk on the phone? I'd really prefer to do this face to face, I insisted. It's important. I could hear him calculating in the silence that followed, weighing the inconvenience of a trip home against the potential consequences of refusing his supposedly recovering mother's request. Fine, he said finally. I can drive down Saturday morning, but I'll need to head back Sunday afternoon. I have a networking event Sunday evening that I can't miss. A networking event he couldn't miss, even when his mother had specifically asked him to come home for important family discussions. He was already planning his escape route. That's perfect, I said. I'll see you Saturday. I spent the week making careful preparations. The house needed to look exactly right, not too obviously prosperous, but comfortable enough to suggest financial stability. I arranged for the staff at Beverly's Kitchen to handle the weekend without me, telling them I had important family business to attend to. Most importantly, I scheduled a meeting with Patricia for Saturday afternoon, asking her to come to the house with all the relevant documents. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood as I watched Marcus's car pull into the driveway. He emerged looking every inch the Ivy League success story, dressed in expensive casual wear that managed to appear both effortless and precisely calculated. His hair was shorter, styled in a way that spoke of frequent visits to upscale salons, and he moved with the confident posture of someone who belonged in exclusive circles. "Hey, Mom," he said, giving me a brief hug that felt more like a social obligation than genuine affection. "You look good. Better than you sounded on the phone last spring." "I'm feeling much better. Thank you." I led him into the living room, where I'd arranged coffee and some of his former favorite pastries from the restaurant. "How was the drive down?" "Not too bad. Traffic wasn't horrible." He accepted a cup of coffee but declined the food, probably conscious of maintaining the lean physique that complemented his expensive clothes. "So, what did you want to discuss? You made it sound pretty serious." I settled into my chair across from him, studying his face as I prepared to begin the most important conversation of our relationship. He looked polished and successful, but there was something hollow behind his eyes, as if all his careful self-construction had come at the cost of anything authentic or genuinely human. "Marcus, I need to tell you about something that happened while you were away. Something that's going to change both of our lives significantly." He leaned forward slightly, perhaps sensing that this wasn't going to be a routine maternal check-in. "What kind of something?" "I discovered that I have family I never knew about. Had family, I should say. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was alive until recently. She died about 8 months ago." Marcus blinked, processing this information with what appeared to be genuine surprise. "Your grandmother? But I thought all your relatives were dead." "That's what I believed too. That's what my father told me. But it turns out he lied about that, among other things." I paused, watching his expression carefully. "My grandmother. Eleanor Whitman spent decades looking for me. She only found me shortly before she died." Wow. That's incredible, Mom. I mean, it's sad that you never got to meet her, but amazing that you weren't as alone in the world as you thought." His response seemed genuinely sympathetic, and for a moment I wondered if I'd been wrong about the depth of his self-absorption. "There's more, Marcus. Eleanor left me her entire estate." Now I had his complete attention. He set down his coffee cup and looked at me with suddenly sharp focus. "Her estate? What kind of estate?" "A substantial one. Properties in Manhattan and the Hamptons, investment portfolios, artwork, jewelry. The total value is approximately $14 million. The number hung in the air between us like an electric charge. I watched Marcus's face carefully, noting the sequence of emotions that flickered across his features. Shock, followed quickly by calculation, then something that looked remarkably like excitement. "14 million?" he repeated, and his voice had taken on a different quality, warmer and more engaged than it had been since he'd arrived. "Mom, that's incredible. That's life-changing money." "Yes, it is." "Have you thought about what you want to do with it? I mean, obviously you'll want to invest most of it wisely. I could put you in touch with some of the finance people I've met through school. They handle portfolios for really wealthy families, and they could help you maximize the returns." Already he was inserting himself into the situation, positioning himself as essential to managing this windfall. The son who'd been too busy to visit his supposedly hospitalized mother was suddenly eager to provide financial guidance. "Actually, Marcus, that's part of what I wanted to discuss with you. Eleanor's will included some very specific provisions about how the inheritance should be handled." "What kind of provisions?" I reached for the folder I'd prepared, containing copies of the relevant documents. "Eleanor knew about you, about our relationship. She'd been having me investigated for over a year before she died, learning about our family dynamics." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "Investigated? That sounds kind of intrusive." "She was trying to understand what kind of person I'd become, what kind of life I'd built. She wanted to make sure her money went to someone who deserved it." I paused significantly. "And she wanted to make sure it wouldn't be wasted on people who didn't truly value family relationships." Something cold flickered across Marcus's expression, as if he was beginning to sense that this conversation wasn't going to unfold the way he'd expected. "What exactly did the will say?" I handed him a copy of the relevant section, watching, as he read Eleanor's carefully worded provisions about distributions to family members who demonstrated genuine love and respect for me. His face grew increasingly pale as he absorbed the implications. "She was evaluating me?" he asked when he finished reading. "Based on how I treated you?" "She was concerned about some things she'd observed. The way you'd been distancing yourself from our family, your obvious discomfort with our background, your tendency to prioritize social advancement over family loyalty." Marcus set down the document with hands that weren't entirely steady. "Mom, whatever this woman thought she observed, she didn't understand the full situation. College is demanding, and building a career requires sacrifice. That doesn't mean I don't love you or value our relationship." "Doesn't it, Marcus?" The question hung between us, heavy with months of accumulated hurt and disappointment. I could see him calculating again, trying to figure out how to navigate this conversation to his maximum advantage. "Of course not. You're my mother. I love you. I've always loved you. When I was supposedly in the hospital for surgery complications, when I called you scared and alone and asking you to come home, what did you tell me?" His face flushed, understanding now that this conversation was heading somewhere he couldn't charm or manipulate his way out of. "I told you I couldn't leave London because of my internship." "You told me it wasn't the kind of emergency that required family to drop everything and rush home. You told me it wasn't fair of me to ask you to sacrifice your future for my medical problems." "Mom, that was—" He stopped, apparently realizing that there was no way to make those responses sound like they came from a loving son. "That was who you really are, Marcus. When someone you claim to love is frightened and alone and specifically asking for help, you prioritize networking opportunities over their well-being." I could see panic beginning to set in as he understood the magnitude of what was at stake. The casual confidence he'd walked in with was cracking, replaced by something desperate and ugly. "I was young. I was under pressure. I made some mistakes," he said quickly. "That doesn't mean I don't care about you. It doesn't mean I don't deserve to benefit from this inheritance." "Deserve?" I repeated quietly. "Tell me, Marcus, what have you done to deserve $14 million? I'm your son, are you? Because for the past 2 years, you've acted like being my son was something to be ashamed of, something to be hidden from your impressive friends, something that interfered with your social advancement." He was quiet for a moment, and I could see him trying to recalibrate his approach. When he spoke again, His voice had taken on a pleading quality I hadn't heard since he was small. "Mom, I know I haven't been the best son lately. College changed me. Maybe not always in good ways. But we can fix this. I can do better. I want to do better." "Do you? Or do you want access to $14 million? Before he could answer, the doorbell rang. Patricia had arrived right on schedule. "That's my attorney," I said, standing up. "I asked her to come by because there are some legal documents that need to be signed today." I opened the door for Patricia, who entered with her usual professional composure carrying a briefcase full of paperwork. She greeted Marcus politely, though I could see the cool assessment in her eyes as she took in his expensive clothes and carefully groomed appearance. "Patricia has been helping me navigate the inheritance process," I explained as we settled back in the living room. "There are some decisions that need to be made today about how Eleanor's estate will be distributed." Marcus looked between us, with growing anxiety. "What kind of decisions?" Patricia opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick stack of documents. "As executor of Eleanor Whitman's estate, I'm required to oversee the distribution of assets according to her wishes. The will gives Beverly complete discretion over how much, if any, of the inheritance should be shared with family members." "But I'm her only family," Marcus said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "That's correct," Patricia replied calmly. "Which means Beverly has to decide whether you've demonstrated the kind of character Eleanor wanted to see rewarded." I watched Marcus struggle with the realization that his future financial security was entirely dependent on a relationship he'd spent years systematically undermining. The young man who'd been too sophisticated to acknowledge his working class origins was now desperately hoping those origins might still claim him as worthy. "Mom, please," he said, and his voice cracked slightly. "I know I haven't been perfect, but I'm still your son. I'm still family. Are you Marcus? When was the last time you treated me like family instead of like an inconvenience to be managed?" He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently unable to come up with a single example of genuine familial behavior from recent years. Patricia continued with her explanation of the legal proceedings. "Eleanor's will requires that any family member who benefits from the inheritance must demonstrate ongoing commitment to maintaining a loving, respectful relationship with Beverly. It's not enough to promise to do better. There has to be evidence of sustained behavioral change." "What kind of evidence?" Marcus asked desperately. "The kind that comes from years of consistent actions," I said quietly. "The kind that proves love is more important to you than money." "But how can I prove that if you don't give me the chance? How can I show you I've changed if the inheritance is already decided?" It was a reasonable question, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of the old maternal instinct to protect him, to give him the benefit of the doubt, to believe that people could change when properly motivated. But then I remembered the phone calls where he'd been too busy to talk, the celebrations he'd excluded me from, the casual dismissal of my supposedly serious health problems, the years of being treated like a social liability rather than a beloved family member. "Marcus, the inheritance isn't a reward for future good behavior. It's a recognition of the kind of person you are right now, today, based on the choices you've already made and the values you've already demonstrated." Patricia handed me the primary distribution document, the one that would determine how Eleanor's fortune would be allocated. I could see Marcus's eyes following every movement, his entire future hanging on words I hadn't yet written. "Based on my observations of Marcus's character and behavior over the past several years," I said slowly, "and in accordance with Eleanor Whitman's wishes that her legacy only benefit those who demonstrate genuine family loyalty." Marcus was holding his breath, his face pale with terror at the possibility of losing access to more money than he'd ever imagined possible. "I am establishing a trust fund that will provide Marcus with a modest annual stipend, sufficient to supplement his career earnings, but not enough to remove the necessity of working or the opportunity to develop genuine character through his own efforts. The relief on his face was palpable, but it was short-lived as I continued. The remainder of the estate, approximately $13 million, will be donated to establish scholarship funds for first-generation college students from working-class families. Students whose parents work in food service, retail, manufacturing, and other professions that some people apparently consider embarrassing. The color drained from Marcus's face as he realized what I was telling him. He would receive enough money to be comfortable, but not enough to be wealthy. The vast majority of Eleanor's fortune would go to help young people who valued their families and weren't ashamed of their backgrounds. "Mom, you can't be serious," he whispered. "I'm completely serious. Eleanor wanted her money to go to people who understood the value of family loyalty and authentic relationships. Since you've demonstrated that those aren't priorities for you, the money will go to people who do understand their importance." Marcus looked frantically between me and Patricia, as if hoping one of us might reveal that this was all an elaborate test that he could still somehow pass. "This is insane," he said, his voice rising. "I'm your son. I'm your only family. You can't just give away $14 million to strangers." "Strangers who will honor their parents and appreciate their sacrifices," I replied calmly. "Strangers who won't be ashamed of where they came from or try to erase their families from their personal histories. I never erased you from my history. Marcus, you asked me to lie about my profession when talking to your college friends. You excluded me from your graduation celebration because you thought I wouldn't fit in with the other families. You've spent 2 years systematically distancing yourself from everything that connected you to our shared life." He was quiet for a moment, apparently understanding that denial was pointless when confronted with such specific examples of his behavior. "People change," he said finally. "I can change. I'm sure you can. And when you do, when you find someone to love who loves you in return, when you start a family of your own and understand what it means to sacrifice everything for your children's well-being, maybe you'll understand why I made this decision." Patricia handed me a pen, and I signed the document that would transform Eleanor's legacy into something that honored the values she'd believed in: family loyalty, authentic relationships, and respect for honest work regardless of social status. Marcus watched me sign with the expression of someone witnessing the end of the world. Everything he'd thought he could count on, all the financial security he'd assumed would be his birthright, was disappearing with each stroke of my pen. "The trust fund will provide you with $25,000 annually," I said as I finished signing. "It's not enough to live luxuriously, but it's enough to supplement whatever career you build for yourself." $25,000? He looked genuinely stunned. "Out of $14 million, you're giving me $25,000 a year? I'm giving you exactly what you've earned through your behavior as my son. If you'd treated me with love and respect, if you'd valued our relationship over social advancement, if you'd shown genuine care for my well-being, the amount would have been very different." The reality of what he'd lost was beginning to sink in, and I could see desperation taking hold as he realized that all his careful social climbing might have cost him more than he could afford. "Mom, please reconsider this. I know I haven't been perfect, but surely I deserve more than strangers do. Surely blood means something. Blood means what you make it mean, Marcus. You've spent years showing me that our blood relationship was something you wanted to minimize rather than celebrate. You've treated me like an embarrassment rather than family." Patricia packed up her documents with professional efficiency. "The legal arrangements are now finalized. The trust fund will begin making payments next month, and the scholarship foundation will be established within 60 days. As she prepared to leave, Marcus made one final desperate attempt to change my mind. "What if I quit the finance track? What if I came home and worked at the restaurant with you? Would that prove that I value family over career advancement?" I looked at him carefully, seeing not the confident young man who'd walked in that morning, but someone who was finally beginning to understand what his choices had cost him. "Marcus, If you came home and worked at Beverly's Kitchen because you genuinely wanted to rebuild our relationship, because you'd realized that family connections were more important than social status, that would mean everything to me. But if you came home just because you found out I had money, that would prove exactly what Eleanor was worried about. He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him struggling with the implications of what I'd said. Any sudden change in his behavior now would be suspect, colored by the knowledge of what he'd lost and what he might still hope to regain. "I don't know how to fix this," he said finally, and for the first time in years, he sounded like the little boy I remembered rather than the calculating young man he'd become. "You fix it by becoming someone worth loving," I said gently. "Someone who values people for who they are rather than what they can do for you. Someone who's proud of where he came from rather than ashamed of it." Patricia left, and Marcus and I sat in silence for several minutes. I could see him processing the magnitude of what had just happened, trying to understand how his carefully planned future had been so completely derailed. "I need to go," he said eventually. "I have that networking event tonight." Even now, even after losing $13 million because of his obsession with social advancement, he was still prioritizing networking over family time. Some lessons, apparently, required more dramatic consequences before they could be learned. "Of course," I said. "Drive safely." He stood up slowly, moving like someone who'd been physically injured. At the door, he turned back to look at me one last time. "Mom, is there any chance? In the future, if I really do change, if I prove that I can be better, is there any chance you might reconsider the distribution?" I looked at my son, this young man I'd loved and sacrificed for and lost to his own ambitions, and felt a complex mixture of love and sadness and hope. "Marcus, the money is gone. The legal arrangements are finalized. But you're not gone, not unless you choose to be. You'll always be my son, and I'll always love you. The question is whether you can learn to love me back, not for what I can give you, but for who I am." He nodded slowly and walked out to his car. I watched him drive away, knowing that this conversation had changed both of us permanently. He would never again have the comfortable assumption that family love came without conditions, and I would never again accept being treated as less than I deserved. 3 months later, I received a letter from Marcus. Not a phone call or a text, but an actual handwritten letter sent to my home address. In it, he told me he'd been doing a lot of thinking about our last conversation, about the choices he'd made and the person he'd become. He said he was taking a semester off from Princeton to figure out who he wanted to be when he wasn't focused on impressing other people. He didn't ask about the money. He didn't suggest that his soul-searching was motivated by hopes of changing my mind about the inheritance. He simply apologized, without conditions or expectations, for treating me badly and promised to work on becoming someone worthy of the love I'd always offered him. I wrote back, telling him I was proud of him for taking time to reflect and grow. I invited him to come home whenever he was ready, not to discuss money or inheritance, but simply to spend time together as family. 6 months later, he came home for Christmas. We spent 3 days together, talking about everything except money. He helped in the kitchen at Beverly's Kitchen, not because he was trying to prove anything, but because he wanted to understand the work that had supported him throughout his childhood. He listened to stories about my mother and grandmother, showing genuine interest in family history he'd once been eager to distance himself from. It wasn't a complete transformation, and I didn't expect it to be. Changing fundamental character takes time and sustained effort. But it was a beginning. A sign that the little boy who'd once loved me unconditionally might still exist somewhere inside the ambitious young man he'd become. The scholarship foundation Eleanor had envisioned became reality the following fall, providing full college funding for 30 students from working-class families. At the first award ceremony, I met young people who reminded me of myself at their age, hungry for opportunity, but proud of their roots, grateful for family support rather than ashamed of their backgrounds. Marcus attended the ceremony with me, and I watched him talking with the scholarship recipients, asking about their families and their dreams with what appeared to be genuine interest rather than social obligation. Afterward, he said he finally understood why I'd made the decision I had. "These kids will never take their families for granted the way I did," he said. "They'll never be ashamed of parents who worked hard to give them opportunities." "No," I agreed. "They won't." That night, as we drove home from the ceremony, Marcus asked if I ever regretted giving away the money. "Never," I said honestly. Eleanor's gift wasn't just the inheritance. It was the power to choose how I wanted to be treated, to demand the respect I deserved, to refuse to accept less than authentic love. And you used that power to teach me a lesson I probably couldn't have learned any other way. I used that power to honor the values that mattered most to Eleanor and to me: family loyalty, authentic relationships, respect for honest work. If that taught you something valuable, then the money served its purpose. We drove the rest of the way home in comfortable silence, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was sitting next to my son rather than a stranger who happened to share my DNA. The Goodwill incident that had started this whole journey felt like it had happened to a different person, someone who'd still been hoping to earn love through sacrifice rather than demanding it through self-respect. That woman had been abandoned in a parking lot and left to figure out her own worth. This woman, the one driving home from a scholarship, ceremony funded by her grandmother's love and wisdom, knew exactly what she was worth. And more importantly, she knew she would never again accept less than she deserved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.